So, was he an American hero and the ultimate savior of the Union, or a dangerous populist whose reckless agenda left a lasting dark stain on history? Well, today we're going to dive deep into the life of one of the absolute most polarizing figures to ever hold office in the United States.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we are unpacking the man, the myth, and the massive controversies that still define Andrew Jackson's legacy. By looking at the exact, on-the-ground events that forged his worldview, we can actually get a much better handle on how his sheer gravitational pull permanently altered the American political landscape.
All right, let's look at the agenda really quick. We've got 5 sections today. First, the frontier orphan, then the military hero, third, the people's president, fourth, battles and bank wars, and finally, a controversial legacy. Starting right off with Section 1. The frontier orphan. And I mean it. A truly tragic, violent start. You see, Jackson's early life was completely defined by staggering loss. Born in 1767, just weeks after his father died in a logging accident, young Andrew grew up right in the middle of the escalating tensions of the American Revolution. And by 1781, he was just 14 years old and completely orphaned. He lost his brother Hugh to a military campaign, his brother Robert to smallpox in a British prison camp, and his mother to cholera shortly after she secured his release. Think about that for a second. This immense, unthinkable trauma forged a fiercely independent young man. Miraculously, despite all those odds, he actually educated himself and got licensed as an attorney in North Carolina by age 20. But there's this one defining, absolutely brutal incident that happened when Jackson was captured as a teenager. A British officer ordered the 14-year-old boy to clean his boots, and Jackson, he just outright refused. In response, the officer struck him with his sword, slashing his head and his hand. This left Jackson with permanent physical scars, but honestly, more importantly, a lifelong burning hatred of the British. It's a moment that perfectly captures his legendary, stubborn defiance. Moving into Section 2, the military hero. Explosive yet incredibly disciplined. This is where we see some really bizarre contradictions in his character. During the brutal Creek War in 1813, Jackson earned a reputation for unmatched ruthlessness. His forces sacked the town of Tallushatchee and later just decimated the Red Stick warriors at Horseshoe Bend. Yet, right in the middle of this exact same violent campaign, Jackson found an orphaned Native American boy on the battlefield. And instead of leaving him, Jackson sent the boy back home to his wife Rachel to be raised as their own son alongside their other adopted nephew. It's such a striking duality, right? Waging a totally merciless war while simultaneously showing this unexpected, highly personal mercy. But if there's one thing that cemented his fame, it was the War of 1812. Just look at these staggering numbers from the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson defended the city with this ragtag force of about 5,000 men, staring down 10,000 highly trained British troops. By using field fortifications and artillery, Jackson's men absolutely decimated the British advance. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties. The Americans? Fewer than 100. The sheer scale of this unbelievable victory instantly transformed Old Hickory into a national savior. Seriously, across the whole country, he was suddenly being compared to George Washington himself. Okay, Section 3, the people's president, taking on the elite. So Jackson's first run for the White House in 1824 ended in absolute outrage. He actually won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but because he didn't have a clear majority, the decision went to the House of Representatives. And there, Speaker of the House Henry Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. The kicker? Once Adams was elected, he immediately turned around and made Clay his Secretary of State. Jackson and his supporters were livid. They decried this as a corrupt bargain. This perceived backroom deal enraged Jackson so deeply that he and his allies went and formed an entirely new political coalition, the Democratic Party, built specifically to wage a populist war on the political elite. And that war culminated in the 1828 election, which was for sure one of the most vicious personal campaigns in American history. Opponents dragged up Jackson's dueling past and even viciously attacked his wife Rachel's honor. While Jackson won in a landslide, the victory was instantly swallowed by tragedy. Rachel, who was deeply distressed by all the brutal public scrutiny, suffered a fatal heart attack just days later. So a grief-stricken Jackson heads to Washington, and his inauguration, it turns into total chaos. The crowds were so desperate to see their people's president that a massive mob stormed the White House reception. It got so wildly out of hand that Jackson literally had to climb out a side window just to escape.
Once he was actually in office, Jackson immediately shook up the government. He championed what his critics dubbed the spoils system. See, he firmly believed entrenched federal officials were just part of a corrupt anti-democratic elite. So what does he do? He fires them. He replaced them with his own political loyalists. He also totally sidelined his official cabinet, preferring to rely on a small, unofficial kitchen cabinet of trusted friends and journalists.
Which leads us to Section 4, Battles and Bank Wars, Fierce Domestic Warfare.
The biggest immediate threat to the country at this time was the Nullification Crisis, and it was fueled by a really severe regional divide. The North favored high tariffs to protect their growing domestic industries, but the South, which was heavily reliant on agriculture, favored low tariffs for cheap imports. The tension boiled over when South Carolina, secretly led by Jackson's own vice president, John Calhoun, by the way, claimed that states actually had the constitutional right to nullify or cancel out federal laws they disagreed with. So this wasn't just a simple tax dispute. It was a constitutional crisis that literally threatened to tear the United States apart.
The boiling point happened at a public dinner in 1830. Picture this. Looking right at the proponents of nullification, Jackson raises his glass and delivers a chillingly direct toast. Our federal union. It must be preserved. Vice President Calhoun, absolutely not backing down, fires right back. The union, next to our liberty, the most dear. This incredibly tense, highly public showdown irreparably split Jackson and Calhoun, drawing a firm line in the sand regarding federal supremacy. But his biggest institutional enemy? The Bank of the United States. Jackson was deeply, fundamentally suspicious of big financial institutions. He believed they fueled boom and bust cycles that ruined everyday citizens. He favored hard currency like gold and silver and state banks. On the other side of the ring was Nicholas Biddle, the extremely powerful president of the National Bank. When Congress passed a renewal of the bank's charter, Jackson just vetoed it. He even pulled federal deposits right out of the bank. In retaliation, Biddle tightened credit specifically to engineer a financial crisis and flex the bank's power. This whole bank war was a monumental clash of wills that, ironically, helped set the stage for the devastating economic panic of 1837, just as Jackson was leaving office. At the same time, Jackson was executing his most controversial domestic agenda. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was a federal policy he fiercely championed. The act allowed the government to exchange Native American lands east of the Mississippi River for new, unfamiliar territories out west. Jackson argued this policy was a necessity, claiming it was the only practical way to prevent endless bloodshed as white settlers aggressively and illegally encroached on native lands. We really need to pause on this stark number. 4,000. That is the estimated number of Cherokee who perished from disease, exposure, and starvation on the forced march known as the Trail of Tears. It stands as the absolute darkest, most violent consequence of Jackson's removal policies. It was an episode of mass displacement and immense human suffering that permanently mars his historical record. Finally, let's move to Section 5, a controversial legacy, judging his impact. Even after retiring to his Tennessee plantation, the Hermitage, Jackson was far from finished with American politics. He remained a massive behind-the-scenes force. He heavily influenced his protégés, including Texas Revolutionary Sam Houston and future President James K. Polk. Right up until his dying days, Jackson successfully lobbied and pulled the political strings required for the annexation of Texas, continuing his lifelong push for American expansionism. He passed away in 1845, having seen Texas statehood virtually secured. His gravitational pull was literally so massive that he single-handedly birthed what historians call the second party system. For decades, American politics simply revolved around one single question. Were you for or were you against Andrew Jackson? His supporters formed the bedrock of the modern Democratic Party, while his many enemies coalesced to form the Whig Party, united almost entirely by their shared opposition to what they called King Andrew. It was a massive political realignment that permanently set the stage for the two-party system we still recognize today. So that brings us right back to our central question. When you look at the totality of his life, the orphaned frontier boy, the brilliant military commander, the champion of the working-class voter, but also the architect of the Trail of Tears and the instigator of severe economic turbulence, how do you judge him? Was he an American hero and the true champion of manifest destiny, or a dangerous populist responsible for ethnic cleansing and democratic instability? The facts from our sources are laid out on the table for you. Now it's up to you to weigh them. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning history.